We have mostly women in key roles as nurses, healthcare workers, and caregivers. They are doctors, community leaders, making decisions or critical decisions to address the compounding impacts of the crisis. Women's participation, therefore, is critical, not only in our fight against the shared global threat, but also in different aspects of disaster management. So are there still gaps? What will be the role of the private sector in achieving true gender equality? Let's all together find out. To start the event, we will have first a welcome from Sabha Sobhani, Director of Istanbul International Center for Private Sector in Development, UNDP. Over to you, Sabha.
Thank you very much, dear panelists, speakers, private sector representatives, and participants. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here today. As we know, the Team Business Initiative is a multi-stakeholder initiative that transforms the way the private sector engages before, during, and after crisis to make people and business more resilient. In the context of COVID, we see the kind of impact it has when we have multiple hazards affecting society, in terms of pandemic, in terms of natural disasters affecting societies, business network, and also people. In this context, CBI has two outputs in its work towards the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Agenda for Humanity. The first goal is to strengthen dialogue and coordination between the private sector and other humanitarian and development actors in disaster risk reduction, emergency preparedness, response, and recovery. And the second goal is to support the ready and able country-level private sector networks to anticipate, respond, and recover from disaster in coordination with other actors. As the Connecting Business Initiative builds the capacity for local action and takes an anticipatory approach to address underlying vulnerabilities, it has recognized that gender needs to be an essential factor in private sector disaster management. Therefore, CBI has conducted gender research to learn from the work and approach that has been so far conducted in the area of gender, private sector, and disaster management. It has become evident that the importance of gender applies both to disasters triggered by natural hazard as well to fragile contexts and conflict-affected areas. In this webinars, the findings of this research will be presented, and we will consider: why is gender important in private sector disaster management? How can the gender considerations further improve the results of the private sector disaster management? And why is gender equally good for business? Although gender, private sector, and disaster management combined is a rather new field, there has been significant steps and achievement made already by different actors. We will hear the select good practices by UN Women, GSMA, and the CBI private sector member network to learn from their experience and to better understand how this is done in practice. Likewise, it is important to know when we are in this progress and to define what is needed to go forward. Therefore, the webinars also offers a space for discussion at the end of the sessions to hear from all of you. The future of this field needs to be defined together. The private sector itself has an important role in this with the support of all actors. We must also remember that while disasters often have devastating impacts, they can also provide a window of opportunity to transform traditional gender norms of the society and of the business sector, to build back better through the gender lenses as to enable a more meaningful development and disaster resilience for the future. I encourage everyone to consider this in the current COVID-19 approach. As the pandemic is creating devastating effects to the overall gender equality progress, it is clear that the time to act on gender for the private sector disaster management is now. I look forward to this interactive session and welcome you.
Thank you, Sabha, for those inspiring words. For me, you very much laid down the roadmap for our future as far as gender is concerned, and I'm very excited to learn more about that and hear from everybody here. When I was offered this moderator post, I said, I'm not a gender expert. And they said, no, it's okay. So, but yeah, I'm just very happy to be here. So, okay, I also would like to highlight that this is a participative event. If you are like me, who really wants to learn more about gender, now is the time to be heard. So you are going to be encouraged to drop questions in the chat box throughout the sessions and to participate to the Mentimeter coming right up. We would like to use the Mentimeter to collect your views. Thank you, Isai. She will be running the technology and show the results on the screen. And now you can see on your screen the code. The code is, take out your phone now and go to www.menti.com and use the code 411303. Yeah, there. So type in the address and password. And then the first question that we have is, why is gender important in your work? You should be able to start typing your answer now. The question is, why is gender important in your work? Oh, I can list a dozen. Let me also take out my cell phone. Do we have early responders? Let's give them some time. Human rights, yes. Come on, don't be shy. Yes, agree. Gender inclusivity is a good business practice. Gender analysis allows us to target our work. Half of their, yes. For real, positive impact in business and for community resilience, we have to factor in gender. Somebody is looking at post-COVID already, very good. Developing programs should include women because of their work in their community. We should have more in the Philippines. A lot of women hold important positions in DRR, but not the top posts. The top posts are still men. How can we break those glass ceilings? Thank you very much for your responses. Okay, all right. Just tell me when. Okay. Gender relations, norms, dynamics affect largely the result. Oh, okay. Very good insights here. Gender. Okay, so let's give a couple of seconds and we close the Mentimeter. Apologies for my background. Okay, I think that's about it. Thank you very much for your responses. Now, all the comments that I see here are very good insights, and it is my pleasure to present to you the research done by Maria Kontro. So let's see if there is a connection to what you have just written and what Maria found out in her research. Over to you, Maria. Oh, before Maria, let's see the map here. We have, oh, okay. So we have a lot of response. We have the top response is on research and reports. And then on toolkits and briefs. Toolkits, yeah, so for standards, standardizing the approaches. And then that's followed by policies and frameworks. Yes, very important. I definitely agree to that. And that's followed by manuals and guides. Yes, that is that would be very helpful to make sure that there's a standard approach. Information programs, yes. All right, very, very good and interesting mapping of the information that we got from them. I'm sure Maria will have a feast working on these insights. So over to you, Maria.
Thank you. My name is Maria Kontro, and I'm a gender research consultant at Connecting Business Initiative. And thank you all for those excellent reflections within the Mentimeter. We'll see now how they connect to the CBI gender research. So a little bit about the background of the research. CBI recognized gender to be an important factor in disaster management and therefore conducted research on gender in private sector disaster management. The research was done mainly through mapping and analysis. So in the mapping, over 180 documents were analyzed and listed. And as we heard, different groups of the mapping, they had been categorized in different categories, and also 47 persons, experts, were interviewed in order to understand where are we now in the field of gender, disaster management, and private sector, those three fields combined. The research also includes case studies in which the main case studies were women-led micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in parallel disasters. The second one is gender and displacement, and the third one, gender, data, and technology in disaster management. I will now present the key points of each chapter of the research, and the full document will also be available later. Next, please. So let's look first on why is gender important in disaster management and what is gender. So gender is a social and cultural construct that assigns status and roles and responsibilities to males and females based on their biological sex. And this can result in gender inequality. Gender inequality increases the vulnerability to disasters, heightens the exposure to risk, and restrains the capacity to respond and recover from disasters. Overall, disasters affect women, men, and girls and boys in different ways, and it's very context specific. We need sex and age disaggregated data in order to understand what is happening. And here is a good example of it. On the left, from graphic from UN Women, where they had 7 different disasters from Asia and Pacific region in which sex and age disaggregated data was available and analyzed. And in blue, we see the percentage, female mortality versus in blue versus male mortality in red. In percentage in 7 different disasters in the region. So even though this is context specific, but we can see that gender is a very significant factor in disaster management. And as mentioned, we need sex and age disaggregated data in each disaster and context to understand what is happening and how is that specific to each context. Yet at the same time, women are most excluded from decision-making in all levels, and their needs are being deprioritized in disaster settings. So in addition to gender equality and human rights, gender inclusion also has a significant impact on the results of disaster management, as it helps to target actions towards the majority of vulnerable people. Next, please. So, as mentioned, we need to understand gender in order to avoid a negative cycle. And with that, I mean that when we have existing inequalities, it creates greater vulnerability to disasters. And then when a disaster strikes, it creates, for example, a downward spiral of poverty, which further increases the vulnerability and inequality, and therefore greater disaster risk. But we also need to understand that, that there might be gender data bias present in disaster management statistics in order to take that into account, because damages and losses in emergencies are often recorded in productive resources and economic sectors, which tend to be disproportionately represented by men. In many contexts, there is also a gendered aspect in land ownership within families. So when a man owns the land in which the entire family works, and this can apply to family businesses as well and influence who then receives the assistance, the humanitarian assistance. Men are also often interviewed as heads of the households in damage and needs assessments. And then we need to ask, whose needs are we reporting and whose needs are we not reporting? Next, please. So this connects to the private sector disaster management in many ways. Just to mention a few here. How is it relevant? Women are overall overrepresented in hardest hit economic sectors in disasters, as well as in the informal sector and micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises that are characterized by informality. And those are the most vulnerable ones in disasters. Women are also more affected by poverty and extreme poverty. The gender wage gap is a factor here, and face multiple barriers to access financing. The responsibility of unpaid work influences women in business in many ways. Even without a disaster, in some communities, women can spend 14 hours a day in these unpaid responsibilities, which economic models classify as leisure time, and this workload increases in disasters. And the unpaid workload then influences women-led micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise recovery and survival in disasters, as time is, as it influences how the time use and how much time is dedicated to businesses. As women work longer hours with paid and unpaid responsibilities combined, their ability to participate in decision-making in humanitarian context becomes limited, and therefore their needs further deprioritized. Gender-based violence is a very significant concern. It increases in disasters and influences women's choices. The different security concerns in disasters might restrict women's ability to work, and as there is a digital gender divide, of which we will hear in the best practices as well. The digital gender divide influences on how women can work or run their business from home. The business sector continues to be male-dominated, and many of these realities affecting women are not systematically considered in business continuity planning. Next, please. So, as mentioned, this doesn't affect only natural hazard context, but also fragile context and conflict-affected areas. There is the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, in which UN has identified 6 priority actions. And one of them is to ensure women's participation in economic decision-making in post-conflict situations. Women And this is for a reason, because women contribute significantly to repair shattered economies after conflict, and there are many relevant considerations within conflict economy and gender-based violence. For example, as billions of dollars are spent every year to peace and security, but we should be also asking whose peace and whose security. Sexual and gender-based violence cost the world between 2 and 5% of its GDP annually. So we should consider these aspects as very core points as well. The private sector, which provides 9 out of 10 jobs in developing countries, has not had a significant role yet. However, there is a significant potential for the private sector companies to make a difference. And one of the first steps could be including the existing private sector mechanisms into the Women, Peace and Security Dialogue. And that could be one of the key steps towards the right direction. Next, please. So, of course, there is a chapter of gender and COVID-19 in this very serious situation. And the impact of the global COVID-19 is deeply gendered. Why I put emphasis on the global, because then this gendered impact affects the entire gender situation worldwide and has already reversed decades of fragile progress in gender equality. The digital gender divide is very essential here. It further increases the impact on women in the private sector and influences their micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Yet here as well, women continue to be excluded from decision-making and their needs deprioritized. The research and mapping showed that before COVID-19, there existed a lot of materials from 2 out of 3 areas, 3 areas being gender, private sector, and disaster management. So there were materials of gender and private sector or gender and disaster management, but very few materials of gender, private sector, and disaster management combined. This was before COVID-19, but as COVID-19 is having an impact both to the private sector and to gender, these materials have increased during the last 6 months. Next, please. And here we connect also to the window of opportunity, because while crises often have devastating impacts, they can also provide an opportunity to transform traditional gender norms and inequalities. Disasters, for example, may change gender responsibilities in a disaster situation, which might then also continue after the disaster. Disasters might also reveal inequality structures and enable an opportunity to address them for further development as well. So Build Back Better is not only about infrastructure, it is also about how to build back better the private sector, how to build back better gender and enable gender equality. And here some important considerations is that as women deal with disaster consequences more directly, women who are involved in businesses have important knowledge to make business more resilient. So women are not only vulnerable people, they are very powerful actors if given the chance. And women are not a minority group. We have to remember women represent 51% of the population and a majority of the population vulnerable to disasters. They're also responsible, often responsible of the other vulnerable groups such as children, elderly, disabled, and gender therefore influences greatly the response and recovery towards the most of affected people. And studies show that gender equality is good for business, and business can react to women's needs. And the existing programs show that companies need to protect their workers, their marketplace, and their supply chains with gender lenses involving women's realities. These are the key aspects of the research. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria, for those interesting findings. It's a good reminder from Maria that we are not a minority and that women, gender equality is good for business. So I really like this window of opportunity and Build Back Better. A lot of insights here that we can bring home and come to play in our program. So at this point, I'm sure our participants have a lot of burning questions. Now is the time. I hope our chat box is full of your questions already. Oh, I'm sad. No questions yet. Do we have any questions from the group? Reactions from the findings or agreement? Do you agree to the result of the research done by Maria?
I had a question. How do you frame the window of opportunity in the context of natural disasters, let's say, versus pandemics or, man-made disasters?
So the window of opportunity is, of course, different in different disasters, and in pandemic situation, it can differ from natural hazard disasters created or triggered by natural hazards, but it's very case specific. So, for example, in the pandemic situation, we can see that the COVID-19 has influenced both the private sector as well as the gender considerations. So there has been and is a window of opportunity to address those two at the same time in disaster management, in response and recovery. So that is a very unique kind of situation, and it depends greatly on the type of natural hazard or a disaster, what kind of windows of opportunities they create. And in this COVID-19 situation, the very essential point that with its impact to both private sector and gender, we should look on how to work with those together.
Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me now? All right. So we have, before we proceed, we go for this question here on the box. Great insights. What can we do to address the problem, especially during during disasters? Would you like to address this now or later, Maria?
Yes, that's a very, very good question. We actually address that question. We will address that question in the third part of the webinar. So we could provide an answer, not answer, but some reflections then, and then to discuss together, because it's important to have everyone's views and overall conversation on the topic.
Okay, all right, thank you. So moving forward to best practices, this discussion will actually focus on what has been done already. Again, before we go into that, we will have another Mentimeter to collect some of your views. he say we'll run the technology and show the results on the screen. So our question at this point is, which kind of good practices on gender will help your work? So code is, again, our code is 4113033. So you may begin typing your answers. Which kind of good practices on gender will help your work? I see the first, couldn't agree more, practical tools. What else? Equal presentation, gender balanced. Very good. Oh, a study in gender in search and rescue. Interesting. I think I know who wrote this. Joke. Inclusiveness. Okay. Including gender inclusive strategies in BCPs. Yes. A very big yes. Case studies to understand what has worked before, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, just adopt it. Agreed. Agreed. Flexibility, assessment, implementation. Common practices, tools, guidelines, and trainings. Context-tailored case studies. Yes, please. What else? Assessment. We have more? Going? You have to brush up on your texting, guys. Okay, I think we have enough. Thank you. Thank you very much for all your responses. We look forward to more of that next. So, okay, now we would like to welcome Ms. Maria Holtzberg, Humanitarian Advisor, UN Women, Asia and the Pacific, to give us an overview on the COVID-19 effect on gender and the private sector, then focusing on the Philippines case. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and thank you, Maria, my namesake, for providing such an excellent overview to start off with. So I'm going to basically take on from where Maria left off and dive a bit deeper into COVID specifically, sharing just some general observations that UN Women have made in this region, and then share input from a survey that UN Women did together with the Investing in Women initiative, which looks like this. You will get to the links afterwards, and also sharing some additional information on how we can advance linking gender, COVID-19, private sector, as well as within the natural disaster context, because as we know, we're using Philippines as an example, but Philippines is now going through the aftermath of the storm Rory in the Philippines. So the next slide, please. So just to do a very quick recap on what we've observed from some extensive surveys that were done almost at the outset of the pandemic. So what we first did was we looked at other pandemics, and we, for instance, Zika or Ebola, and then we transferred that over into an analysis in Asia Pacific. And then as the pandemic has moved, we validated the observations. This is not only UN Women's work, this is work that has been done by all UN actors and members of the Gender in Humanitarian Action Working Group. So what we've seen in about 11 months into the pandemic is that what we thought was going to happen in terms of impact to women and girls in all their diversity has actually happened. And so what we're seeing is increased discrimination. We've seen increased violence against women, as well as protection risks. We've also seen low-paid informal roles experiencing quite extensive job cuts, and we're going to focus more on that in this overview. And exclusion of women in the leadership roles in terms of recovery, and also exacerbated burdens of unpaid care work, and also much more. But just to dive a little bit more deep into this, what we has seen is a really high rise in gender-based violence. And this is very much connected to lockdowns and quarantine measures, which very often have confined women with their abusers. I'm also conscious of time, so I will be a little bit succinct here. But what we've also saw that women in Asia working in low-paid informal roles, such as cleaning, cooking, or caring for children, have done so or do so without proper contracts or social protection, and are therefore disproportionately experiencing the impacts of job cuts. So we've seen large reductions of their working hours. We saw this from surveys conducted in Bangladesh and in Philippines. And the garment industry is another example where which obviously employs millions of women in Asia, was severely hit by COVID-19. And we've also seen that women are most likely to report drops in income from investments or savings, as well as financial support. And they are also less likely than men to report increases in income from support from charities or income from government support. So the social protection is not always reaching the women who are most in need. Next slide, please, which we will skip, but I'm just saying that what we know is that the COVID-19 pandemic is rapidly turning into a profound economic crisis. And we have enough data on this to showcase this. And we will share this slides with you so you can review it yourselves. So now you can move to the next slide, please. What this overview and what I'm focusing on today is really to do a deep dive into the survey I showed you before, which is a collaboration between Investing in Women Initiative and UN Women, who've done a survey to look at the impact of COVID-19 on private sector workers and employers in the Philippines. And it's investigated the short-term impact of COVID on the private sector. And they've looked specifically at, in terms of work, household dynamics, and mental health. And what we want to do today is to just give you a couple of perspectives of this, and then link it to, well, how do you manage this in a disaster or humanitarian context? Next slide, please. Just to share that we do see that it did have a immediate and negative impact on the private sector employees and employers in the Philippines. And the employees report experiencing significant pressures on their financial security and in their domestic life. So the intensification of unpaid domestic care and household work was especially strong for women, who reported this having a very strong impact on their mental health. So you see a connection here. The impact on the crisis on men's mental health was also very strong, but for different reasons. Just also want to share with you that the data was collected through an online survey facilitated by YouGov. And the target population was private sector workers from the formal sector who have internet access. And then there's a small employer survey also. So what of the things that we saw was that 2/3 of workers experienced a variety of work-related changes, and half of the workers in the hardest hit areas had their jobs suspended, terminated, or had cut in hours or pay. And it's important to also say that more women than men experienced temporary suspensions and cuts in their hourly pay. We can move to the next slide, please. So here are some of the impacts that we saw both on household and on the health and well-being. And what we've done is try to link it with a solution. And I'm running out of time, so I will just give you some of the top ticket components. So for instance, women have reported feeling much more domestic pressure than men because of COVID-19, and more than half of the workers spent more time on childcare, food preparation, and cleaning than they did before the pandemic. Women also had greater increase in the time they spent on food and cleaning. At the same time, more than 60% of private sector employees, women and men, reported that they felt more income pressure in the early stages of the crisis than before. So what is the solution that we're looking at? And especially linked to how to also address some of the questions that came into the chat about, well, what should we be doing from a preventive perspective and in terms of building back better? So we've put on the other side of the slide, we're looking at, well, what's some of the solutions, which could simply be looking at cash-based incentives, for instance, where we tie into broader resilience and adding this into a humanitarian response. So this entails focusing specifically on small, medium enterprises that are run by women or women focused, to ensure that they are back on their feet and then they can support their caregiving functions. Another solution is to look at women-focused organizations and networks who can then draw on and build on some of the care component work that is being advanced. Next slide, please. So what we saw, or the three key top ticket items, is what could employers and governments do differently? And what was very clear was that the need for financial support, both from their employer and from the government. And employees, especially those with internet, working from internet components, they needed better access to internet and utilities. And really wanted more government support. Whereas we also saw that there's a strong support for the government to provide mass testing, and this is a COVID component, and making it available in every workplace. So you see here where you wanted the government engagement to come in quite strongly as part of the disaster response. Now I'm talking about the response to the storm, but also as part of a overall COVID-19 response. And we can go to the final and last slide, which also outlines some of the issues that we want to advance if you put gender at the center of a pandemic response, and making sure that you have the credible data and analysis, and making sure that all of the coordination work is being done together with women-focused networks. In the chat, I will also put a guidance note that has been prepared by UN Women on how to ensure private sector can scale their work using gender responsive measures. So it's basically actioning what we saw from this survey. I will be quiet now because my time is up. Thank you very much for this time. Over.
Thank you, Maria. Very interesting insights here. Mental issue is a big concern right now, but as far as closing the gap on women in gender, it will have to take a whole of society approach to move towards gender equality. Thank you very much. A lot of insights there, good insights. Now we go to our next best practice on women's small enterprises survival in a double disaster. Please welcome Joanna Spencer, Vanuatu Business Resilience Committee, also a CBI network. Over to you, Joanna.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I have to apologise. I don't know if I'm being shown on your screen, but I'm in a very dark room. So you might not be able to see me very clearly. Thank you for inviting the VBRC to join this webinar. As mentioned, my name's Joanna and I'm an advisor funded by the Australian government here in Vanuatu, working actually with the Vanuatu Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I've been with the Chamber for about 2 years now, and during that time, the Vanuatu Business Resilience Council came to being, funded through UNDP/CBI. So we're very neatly tied into the work of CBI. The VBRC, as we call it, sits underneath the Chamber of Commerce and Industry here in Vanuatu and focuses mainly on economic resilience and the private sector's role in humanitarian response. When I started, we didn't really have a lot of funding for activities under the VBRC, but we've managed to turn this around, and over the last 18 months, we are now involved in the implementation of several really exciting projects aimed at building the resilience of the private sector to withstand economic and natural disaster shocks. And yes, what a year we've had here in Vanuatu in that regard. The VBRC, it has 8 executive members, all business owners who are living and working here in Vanuatu. Meets monthly, and of course with the COVID-19 border closures and then following closely with a Category 5 tropical cyclone, Cyclone Harold, has meant that the private sector has really experienced 2 compounding crises in the last 9 months. With the border closing, it's affected Vanuatu in a huge way. About 40% of the GDP relies on tourism income. And so the border closure in itself has created serious economic hardship in the private sector. When the borders were closed in March, it was a matter of less than 2 weeks later that we were hit with the Cat 5 cyclone, which affected about 150,000 people in the Northern Islands of Vanuatu. It's exactly what we did not need at that time, and was very difficult during that time also to respond in an active way, seeing that there was very little coming in and out of the country. And any aid that was delivered was taking 14 days in quarantine to make sure that the the coronavirus was not passed into the country. We still remain to this day COVID-free, would you believe? But it has meant that we've been in a state of emergency since March with the border closures and various other stipulations to travel. So going back to what happened, gender, of course, was a big focus of the cluster system here in Vanuatu, with the majority of those affected being women and girls by both COVID, the border closures, and Cyclone Harold. So a lot of the informal sector, so the small business, micro business, young entrepreneurs were already severely affected economically by the border closure, and then were hit with huge issues related to the cyclone, more around food security, but also access to transport, shipping, moving around. So what was the VBRC doing during all of this time? We were working very, very hard. And we formed, it was an incredible time actually. It was about 50 to 60 business owners or leaders who came together from a range of industry sectors to work on, we called ourselves the Private Sector Working Group Cluster. And what we did is meet every couple of days and see what we could do, because really, as we all know, especially in a natural disaster, the majority of response is managed by the private sector, especially in a country like Vanuatu. The government were not prepared, and by that I mean did not have the stores of aid that were required to react quickly, with not being able to bring in outside help, which we've done many times before in times of disaster, planes, ships, etc. from Australia and New Zealand, our partners. It meant that we were on our own. So the private sector really came to the fore and did an incredible job in coordinating and helping the logistics cluster, the gender cluster, sanitation, wash, shelter. It was a really amazing time. But moving on from that, just to give you a bit more of an understanding of what the Business Resilience Council were doing and have continued to do, is a real focus on business resilience in Vanuatu. And by that, I mean, as I mentioned before, not just humanitarian based or readiness based, but in business resilience in an economic format as well. We've had a really busy year running a lot of business continuity planning workshops, going out to the provinces, going out to the islands, and just helping businesses survive this very tough time. So even though we started with business continuity planning, we've changed that to business survival planning, and we've supported a huge number of small businesses in the last 6 to 9 months. So while we were doing all of this, and then Harold came along, we were made aware of a call out by the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund for proposals for an envelope of money under their emergency response window on COVID-19. It was focused on financing projects with the aim of specifically providing a gender responsive response to the COVID crisis. And the VBRC being focused on the private sector and strengthening the private sector, we saw an opportunity to design a proposal which would fit under the intervention outlines of the WPHF, which was supporting women who will be the most economically affected by the crisis, namely daily wage earners, small business owners, and those working in the informal sector. This could be done through cash transfers, community funds, and to support women-led small business. So what did we do? In a very male-dominated political and social environment, we recognise that there's multiple barriers to women achieving in business, and there's also significant evidence of gender-based violence in the community affecting Vanuatu women's quality of life. Unfortunately, Vanuatu also shares one of the highest rates of domestic violence and sexual violence in the Pacific, along with being #1 for natural disasters. So what we did was we based our submission specifically on supporting women who could then support other women. And that was how we came up with the Phoenix Project, which was focused on accelerating economic recovery by providing targeted support to women, small business owners, who in turn will lead the economic recovery of their communities. I say will because we are currently in the midst of a startup phase. So our first events and activities are starting in 2 weeks' time. So we're really at the beginning of this process. Why did we call it the Phoenix Project? Well, I was having a particularly creative day when drafting the project proposal, and I saw this as a great opportunity for women-led businesses to rise from the ashes of post-COVID and herald and spread their wings and fly. That was the visual that I had in my head anyway, so we went with that. The basic premise of the project is preparing women business owners with participating business owners to give them tools to endure this current period of economic downturn, then support them to re-establish their businesses here in Port Vila being the capital. We didn't want to spread too far and wide, and we recognised that the communities in the urban area had more potential of utilising strengthened networks, but also being able to support their community, which unfortunately urban areas have been more predominantly hit by the economic downturn than any other areas in the country. What we will be doing is including a mix of activities, including life coaching sessions, business skills training and network development programs, and then providing a cash grant at the end of the 12 months, which will then help these businesses be able to expand and grow and hire other women who have been a part of the project. Just on an aside, one of the amazing features of our response over the last couple of months since June, July through the VBRC has been focusing funding we've received for COVID on supporting women through life coaching. I think, especially through government, it's always very focused on the practical, the economic, the obvious, whereas we recognise that a lot of our women, small business, medium business, micro business women, weren't just carrying the burden of their business not doing well, but job loss in the household, schools shut, economic pressure from external family members, and they needed social support. They needed life coaching and support to strengthen them to get through this next period. And that's why that's going to be a big focus of ours, is diving deep in with these women on how we can support them outside of their business as well as inside. I think I've run out of time, but I did want to bring up the issue that has been prior mentioned, is the vulnerability of women during this time. And we're very aware that there are risks to this project, especially control over income, and really closely monitoring how these women are able to exercise control over their lives and their earnings, especially when we have a grant facility, which will be a substantial amount to a lot of these women to get back up and running. We also want to make sure that these women in business are able to balance work and household responsibilities and not put any more pressure on family in the family unit at this time. And to assist with conflict and violence in the household. So we've actually partnered with, it's the Vanuatu Women's Centre here in Port Vila, that works directly with families on domestic violence and sexual intimate partner violence in the community. So we're hoping hand in hand, we will be able to see some sustainable change during this very difficult time for the private sector. That's a very, I've shoved a lot into that very short amount of time, but I appreciate everyone listening.
Thank you, Joanna. Excellent example, and we wish you luck for your Phoenix project, and we hope to hear from you. Give us an update about it. It is important that we are aware of the realities around our program, around our project, but what is more important is that we carry on, and we have good objectives, solid foundations. Success will be there. Good luck to you. And one thing that I really like a lot is the life coaching sessions. I think I will bring back that idea to my team and make that a part of our platform we call CCUP, which provides support to our micro and small medium enterprises, especially those led by women. Okay, thank you very much. Now for our last example, can we hear from Belinda Baah, Insights Manager, Mobile for Humanitarian Innovations, GSMA, about the digital gender divide. And in her talk, I believe this will actually connect more dots and answers from our Mentimeter earlier. Over to you, Belinda.
Right, thank you for the introduction, Veronica. As mentioned, my name is Belinda Baah, and I'm an Insights Manager in the GSMA's Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation team, where we focus on how mobile technology can be used to improve the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Next slide, please. So before diving into the best practice, I wanted to touch briefly on research we conducted last year on the mobile gender gap with regards to mobile phone usage and ownership and mobile internet usage. As part of a larger piece of work titled The Digital Lives of Refugees, we dug into the use, access, and barriers of mobile services across 5 thematic areas: gender and inclusivity, mobile financial services, digital identity, mobile-enabled utilities, and food security and climate in 3 different contexts. So in Bidi Bidi settlement in Uganda, Kasiba refugee settlement in Rwanda, and urban Jordan, refugees in urban Jordan. We then dug deeper into what this data looked like specifically for people with disabilities and women, so the latter of which will be my focus today. So in Jordan, the rates of both mobile ownership and use of internet-enabled phones are more equal between men and women. But as can be seen on the slide, there are very clear gender gaps across all three metrics measured in both Kasiba and Bidi Bidi, with the mobile gender gap being most stark in Bidi Bidi settlement. So the mobile gender gap was 5%, 13%, and 54% in Kasiba, and 23%, 47%, and 89% in Bidi Bidi for mobile phone usage and ownership and mobile internet usage respectively. And it should also be noted that these gaps widen as use cases become more diverse, so doing more complicated things with the phone. And for my mobile financial services work, the gaps became wider. So if the mobile ownership gender gap was closed in Bidi Bidi alone, 15,500 more women would own a mobile phone. So these gaps show the need and importance of targeted interventions aimed at improving access and usage of mobile technology for women and other marginalized groups in humanitarian contexts to ensure that nobody is left behind when technology, and specifically mobile technology, is being used to deliver humanitarian assistance. Next slide, please. So from this piece of research and other research conducted at the GSMA, we've come up with a number of recommendations aimed at helping organizations reach women in humanitarian contexts. So the first is to collect gender disaggregated data. So this goes back to what Maria was saying in the opening of this webinar. This will allow humanitarian actors to size and monitor the mobile gender gaps where they work. And without this, actors will be unable to identify the problem they face or identify whether the gap is growing or shrinking. So the GSMA, in partnership with REACH and supported by the Emergency Telecoms Communications Cluster, so the ETC, has produced and will soon publish the Connectivity Needs and Usage Assessment Toolkit, KNUA, a bit of a tongue twister, which aims to provide the tools to humanitarians and their key stakeholders to measure mobile phone access, usage, preferences, and digital skills of populations of concern in a robust and standardized manner, which will in turn enable them to assess and provide appropriate digital humanitarian interventions. So as mentioned, without understanding the baseline and the foundation in which we're working on and understanding where, for example, women are in terms of their use of mobile technology, it's impossible to provide targeted, efficient interventions. So this data is necessary to make sure that the interventions that are provided are fit for purpose. The second is training. Actors should work together to provide training around literacy and digital skills. And if implemented well, this will remove some of the barriers and some of the key barriers for women wanting to access mobile phones for the first time or to diversify the services that they utilize. So again, in July and August 2019, last year, the GSMA M4H team, so my team, conducted training in Rwanda with MTN mobile money agents on the humanitarian code of conduct to ensure that agents working with Rwanda's refugee population and host communities uphold protection standards. This is a similar kind of the best practice example that I'll go into in a minute, goes into how we are working with both, working to ensure both end users, with an emphasis on female users, are trained to use mobile financial services for their benefit, but also become agents to facilitate and increase the use of mobile technology and mobile financial services where appropriate. And finally, handset supply. So humanitarian actors should work together to ensure that durable and affordable handsets are readily available, which will help women become less reliant on the handsets of others, because women have lower ownership and borrow more than men and other marginalized groups. Where cost is a major problem, innovative options such as finance models should be considered to help more women become phone owners. Just to also touch on the fact that we have a team at GSMA called the Connected Women team, and it's tasked with working with mobile network operators to improve access and use of mobile services for women across the globe. And though their work is not specific to the humanitarian sector, all of the recommendations that they provide are also applicable to the sector. So in addition to the recommendations you see here, considerations around safety and security. So for example, services that help women feel safer online, relevance, for example, communication and communicating with populations of concern and women, the relevance of mobile technology to women's day-to-day lives, and also accessibility. So for example, making sure that internet services are available in local languages are some other recommended ways to reach women. And more information on this and the work that we do at GSMA can be found on our website. Please go to the next slide. So now to just go into our best practice project I'd like to share with you all. This project was conducted in collaboration with the Grameen Foundation and MTN Uganda, so a large mobile network operator in Uganda. So the aim of this project was to address some of the challenges faced by refugees in Bidi Bidi settlement in Uganda, which included limited awareness of financial services and misperceptions about who can and cannot use financial services, and specifically gendered barriers to financial inclusion, which included women having limited mobility from their homes due to heavier household workloads, which was mentioned earlier as well, generally lower education levels, lack of documentation, collateral and guarantors required to qualify for many formal financial services, and the fact that women are just less trusting of new or unfamiliar financial services. And crucially, they often do not believe that many financial service providers are interested in them and actually see them as clients. So to address these challenges, Grameen developed a contextually appropriate, engaging digital literacy training program to increase refugees' awareness of the range of mobile financial services available to them and their use cases, and to build their ability to access these services by carrying out mobile financial service transactions on their mobile phones, ultimately increasing the uptake of mobile financial services in the Bidi Bidi settlement camp. And by recognizing the gender gap in use of mobile financial services, a woman-centered design approach was taken in program needs and assessments and curriculum design. So Grameen's woman-centered approach included engaging women, men, and youth in training needs assessments, utilizing sex disaggregated assessment data. So again, touching on what Maria mentioned earlier at the beginning of the webinar, and targeting rural women as end users of the training, and specifically engaging rural women as digital literacy change agents to ensure that they would have access to and engage other rural women with mobile financial service training. This training was split into 7 different modules, including modules on the differences between traditional and digital financial services, requirements for opening a mobile money account, and action planning. Next slide, please. So in 2015, GSMA research on women's digital literacy demonstrated that women depend on a variety of different information channels to gain information on how to use mobile phones. And there are clear benefits and drawbacks of each of these different sources. So to take advantage of the benefits and minimize the drawbacks, Grameen, MTN Uganda, and GSMA utilize a combination of community resource persons and women's social circles as training delivery channels in order to maximize the advantages and minimize the drawbacks associated with each delivery channel, which you can see on this slide here. The hope was that by utilizing different ways of engaging with those on the training would improve the probability of active engagement. And it was expected that increasing local residents' ability to use mobile financial services through a women-centered approach would have a threefold effect. So the first being that women and other refugees within Bidi Bidi settlement would increase their uptake of mobile money services once they were aware of the full range of digital financial products available, and recognizing the value proposition to them, so the benefit to their lives, and would hopefully be able to confidently use and troubleshoot these services independently. Secondly, the hope was that women would be able to complete mobile financial services transactions independently without the help of a mobile money agent or another helper, so that women would be able to use these services more frequently since they could transact at any time through their mobile phone. So lessons learned from other women's financial inclusion programs indicate that poor rural women will also be more likely to take up mobile money services once they recognize that mobile network operators are interested in them and actually value them as customers. And finally, it was expected that the training and equipping local women as digital literacy change agents, so giving women the power to do this work themselves, would set them on a pathway to become mobile money agents in the future by empowering them to promote mobile financial services within their communities and linking them to local agent network managers, so master agents, so they can manage their liquidity. Evidence has shown that female agents can increase clients' confidence and that many women prefer interacting with female agents. So the curriculum has now been validated through the training of 25 women, and the training program will be scaling up in 2021 with the hope of training 3,000 more people, the majority of which will be women. I hope this has given a bit of a highlight on the type of work that we do at the GSMA. And there's a lot more to say, but I know that my time is up, but please feel free to reach out at any point if you would like to find out a bit more about what we're doing in this space.
Thank you, Belinda. It is clear now that the private sector is an important opportunity in closing the digital gender gap in humanitarian context and thus addressing gender for improved results in disaster management. And if there's anything that COVID underlined at this point is the fact that digital gender gap is critical to be addressed. And now that there is a digital evolution as far as infrastructure is concerned, especially on digital financial services, women should have access to all this for their survival as well as for managing their businesses. So we lost some time out there. We are supposed to have 5 minutes for Q&A, but maybe we can extend for 2 more minutes just to welcome 1 or 2 questions. Do we have any? You can raise your hands if you want to say something. We have 1. Okay, so we have a question here. In certain countries, women play a big role in NGOs, but they don't necessarily have the power because of a macho culture. So NGOs are tolerated only as an adjunct to government departments. Are there practical suggestions to remedy this issue? I think this question is open to our 3 panelists. Is that correct, Maria? Anybody would like to respond to this?
This is Maria from UN Women. I'm happy to take a first stab at responding to this, if that's okay. Sorry, I don't know how to turn. I see now how I could have raised my hand. Sorry, but just to say that. Yes, it depends a little bit on, well, this is why I believe that the whole sector, the whole humanitarian and disaster risk reduction sector needs to and have in many ways advanced women-focused organizations. So what we're talking about is both highlighting the importance of those organizations that represent women in all their diversity, to have them be integral actors when it comes to disaster preparedness, disaster planning, and disaster response. On the other side, there's also a lot of research that shows the importance of ensuring women's leadership within the response agencies as well as bigger NGO responders. And this is something that there's enough evidence to show the importance of this, and there's enough evidence to show how we can work on this. And this talks about promoting women's leadership. So if you don't have enough women in your leadership or in your NGO or in your organization, you need to look at your hiring practices. You need to look at how you bring women on board. Is it because you're not providing enough parental leave? Is it because the pay is not? Do you have flexible working hours? So it brings in both of those aspects. I think that I will stop at that. I'm sure others will have more responses as well.
Excellent practical tips there, Maria. Made me think. Anybody else who would want to respond to that? Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to turn you over to Maria for our future steps.
Thank you. So this section of the webinar focuses on the way forward. And here, just to open the conversation, because we very much want to hear from all of you, just to give some reflections that it's very important to consider the way forward, because risk will be more complex in the future, more interconnected risk factors. So doing Build Back Better with gender lenses is very important to recover using gender lenses and to build back better. And there, the window of opportunity also in COVID-19 is very essential. We need to reflect how to approach the matter in the current situation. And one of the starting points is the data, of course, to understand what is happening and why, to recognize the underlying factors of risk also in gender, from gender perspective. Next, please. So I have gathered here some considerations to start with, and we must remember that this is gender, private sector, and disaster management combined is quite a new field. So this is the first step, and therefore we would like to hear from you, from all the participants, of what is needed for the future. What kind of events, for example, would help your work to address gender. And some highlights from the CPI gender research on the process, as well as this connecting to the best practices that were presented, that it's important that women's voices are heard, so we can build partnership with gender actors, such as women's organizations and the private sector actors. That's important to connect the knowledge of these two areas, and to apply gender lenses in all activities that private sector does in disaster management, to enable that women's needs and inequality structures are being addressed. So we must remember as well that these are not minority needs. These might be needs of a majority of vulnerable population, and therefore having a very significant impact on the results of what we are doing. Knowledge building is important in the process. The private sector has a very essential role in advocacy. They can advocate, for example, for the collection of sex and age disaggregated data in disaster situations, and they can collect that themselves as well within their operations, and that's how we advance the gender and private sector matter. They can also advocate for the importance of gender, for the improved behaviors, for the participation of women, recognizing them as important actors in this process. It's also very important to connect the dots of the three fields. There exists very good knowledge and know-how and materials on gender, on private sector, and disaster management. We need to bring these together. We also here want to connect the actors and structures to have a coordinated action. So, for example, I understand that in the Philippines, the private sector has a seat in the humanitarian country team. So that's an excellent example of how to enable dialogue, how to advance the matter. And gender is addressed within humanitarian country teams, of course. And capacity strengthening is one of the areas. Materials, as were mentioned, I believe, in some of the comments, to have materials, trainings, manuals, toolkits for different situations and disaster scenarios. To have to collect more evidence and best practices, because best practices, as we saw from these three best practices, they help very, very much to know how this can be done, what has been done already, and how to go forward. So I also wanted to include here some recommendations from UN Women on the key themes, as they have recognized that, for example, support for women-owned and women-led businesses is important to direct that support. And as we saw in the Vanuatu best practice, and support for women workers, and to support for informal workers, as we remember that that women are overrepresented in the informal sector of the economy. So these are just some considerations to start with, but we want to hear from you. What is needed for the future? What do you consider are the key steps, and what do you need for your work? What kind of support? Because we do want to advance the this work and go forward. So I understand we have a Mentimeter activity as well as a discussion section for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. You have given us building blocks here to work on. So let's have our Mentimeter for our final session this afternoon. The question is, what do you consider is needed for the future? Type away. So the code is 4113033. Right? Okay, while waiting for the Mentimeter, we have a comment on the chat box. Support for gender initiatives. Okay. And then recognition of the benefits of women empowerment. Gender mainstreaming and gender sensitivity. Exactly, data, yes. More webinars and trainings, yes. Targeted work programming to include gender inclusive practices and usual business recovery strategies. Okay, do you have any comments or insights for the responses, Maria?
Yes, I think those are very, very essential considerations. Data is very much needed in order to understand, because we need to understand what is happening in order to address, to target actions. As we remember, gender situation in disasters is very context specific. It depends from region to region, as well as from disaster to disaster. Disasters do affect women, men, girls, and boys in different ways. But how? That is very context specific. And as we remember, the private sector can have a significant role in the data. So I very much like that comment. And here, gender mainstreaming and gender sensitivity is very important. To have gender present in all activities that we do, from the evaluation of the situation, situation analysis, to implementation, and then to evaluation, and to have then the constant cycle of learning and doing. I noticed that we have a new comment, social change in how women are perceived. Exactly. And I do think that dialogue is important here. And that connects to the data. When we do have statistics of what is happening, we can really connect it to the social change and the dialogue. And here the role of private sector in advocacy for gender in disaster management is part of the process. So that's an excellent comment as well. I think we have very good reflections overall of how to go forward. I noticed there is the recognition of the benefits of women in empowerment. Exactly. So we do have statistics that tell that women's empowerment improves disaster management, it improves development. So we do need again to connect that to the dialogue in the private sector, in the disaster management field, in order to have it recognized throughout, because there's a lot of situations in which it's not just discussed enough, and therefore providing information, enabling dialogue is often very essential. And we have targeted work programming to include gender inclusive practices in usual business recovery strategies. That is excellent. And more webinars and trainings open up the conversation and translate to practical activities. That's excellent to hear. And more dialogue, more webinars, more trainings, and more best practices, more evidences of how this is. So I think it has been excellent to hear of the three panelists of how this has been going and to guide the way forward.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Maria. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. So as much as we'd like to keep this going, we will have to move to the closing remarks. And may I call on Karen, the CBI coordinator, for her closing remarks. Over to you, Karen.
Thanks so much, Veron. I just really want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for participating today. First of all, the speakers, Sabha from our UNDP, from our Operations Management Committee from CBI for the introductory comments, and all of our speakers for the really thoughtful presentations, Maria from UN Women, Joanna from VBRC, and Belinda from GSMA, and of course, Maria for all her hard work on the study and the work that she's done. And of course, all of you for participating today. Thanks for taking the time. I hope you really found it as interesting as we did. As Maria mentioned, this is just the first step for CBI in this area. So as we're going to continue to develop this work stream to improve gender considerations in disaster management, to ensure that no one is left behind. And we will hope that all of you will join us in this journey. Please let us know if you have any more comments, any suggestions, or if you would like to collaborate with us. As we can see from all of the presentations, this is a very timely subject. We need to move on this now. So please do reach out. We will be sharing the presentations and also link to the recording if you're interested. And we hope to hear from you soon. And finally, thank you very much, Veron, for being a wonderful moderator. We can always count on you, and I know it's a difficult time in the Philippines right now. So we sincerely appreciate your participation. In particular today, you're always busy, but it is a very, very difficult time, and our thoughts and hearts go out to you and the people from the Philippines. So take care, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good day to you all.
Thank you.